Welcome back to the Black Table here at the Black Star Network. I'm your regular host, Greg Carr, and this is our weekly hour devoted to topics of particular interest to people of African descent and to others working together to build a better world. Those of you who are regular viewers here at the table know that we have had a range of scholars and workers and folk who are all working together to build a better world. And we've had a range of folk who have looked at the world that we have been born into, how it got this way, and what we can do to fix it for the better. We've had Howard French and Toyin Falola. We've had Kwasi Kanadu and Lucius Outlaw. We've talked to folk who are in the streets and in the academy and all across the range. And today we've got someone who adds to that list, who is familiar with a lot of those folks and who, like so many of our guests, is fighting with both fists, and an intellectual of the first order who is translating a lot of that dense scholarship into readily accessible prose and also in dialogue with so many of us across the range. Very excited to have him today join us to discuss two of his books with emphasis on the second, one, Colonialism and Global Perspective, and two, Black Ghost of Empire, The Long Death of Slavery and the Failure of Emancipation, from Tufts University, Professor Chris Manjapra. And he, or Manjapra, as I should say, he would be too polite not to correct, but glad to have him, a son of the Bahamas, a professor, as I said, Tufts University, an award-winning professor. In fact, he won the 2015 Emerging Scholar Award from Diverse Magazine. A brother who has been a fellow at the Berlin Institute for Advanced Study, the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, and as we used to say in grad school, UCLA, or they call it the University of California at Los Angeles. Chris, it's good to have you here at the Black Table, brother.
It's good to see you, brother. And thank you for this invitation. I really look forward to our conversation.
With pleasure, with great pleasure. Listen, man, you I almost don't know which way to start, and maybe we'll get into the books in a few minutes, but both of the books that I mentioned start very powerfully in very gripping fashion. You start in the museums, and of course the museum wars are hot in Colonialism and Global Perspective. But when you enter the conversation in Black Ghosts of Empire, it's really autobiographical in a way, and it reminds us all of a recent ancestor, someone who made a recent transition, our friend and brother Randall Robinson, for whom scholarship and his work was very personal. So if you don't mind this morning, man, for those who may not be familiar with you, give us a little bit of your background and autobiography. How did you come to where we are today?
Yeah, sure. So, and the book begins on that note. I go back home in the beginning of the book, and my home is the island where I was born, Bahamas, Nassau, and my people come from the bigger island of the Bahamas, Andros, which also is the least populated. And, on the northern coast, there's a town called Mastic Point. That's where my family's from. And we know certain things and we don't know certain things, as many of us, obviously, who come out of the history of racial slavery and the ways that our people and our ancestors have transcended those conditions. That's what I was going back to at the beginning of this book on a return journey. I was looking for my fourth grandmother, my great-great-great-grandmother, who I learned her name only maybe 5 years ago. Her name was Lorena Woodside. And I go back to the village of Mastic Point looking for traces of her. And, I do find her there, but in a way that I wasn't expecting. And that's often how our ancestors speak to us. They speak to us, but not in the ways that we necessarily expect.
Absolutely. I love the metaphor that forms part of the spine of the text, the question of ghosts and the holes, the whole metaphor, man. Could you explain a little bit? I was talking with my students about this the other day as I was reading your work. Yeah, ironically, it was in a hip hop class. So when we got to the ghost line, they were able to apply it between the so-called golden age of hip hop and today. It's like this ghost line. But could you give us the metaphor? What is it about these holes that are natural formations that you then seize upon as a metaphor, and maybe the metaphor of ghosts? How does that figure into your work?
Yeah, that's great, Greg. I love those two questions in terms of the the two metaphors at the beginning of the book that I introduce. One of them, when I go to Mastic Point, there is this special formation that we have in some islands of the Bahamas. They exist in parts of Mexico, and they exist throughout the Caribbean. They're called blue holes, and these are these deep holes, in the limestone of the island, in the bedrock of the island, and they go down, 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 sometimes for miles. And some of them also have these underground tunnels that lead out into the ocean. And so this, when you encounter a blue hole, they're these small pools, but they are miles deep, and it gives them a very otherworldly look. They look like these eyes, really, like looking at an iris, and you see the world, the sky, the forest. Andros is a forested island with pine trees. You see the forest, you see yourself looking into the hole, but you can't really see what's down there. You cannot perceive what's down there. So it's really quite mysterious and enigmatic. And that's an experience of finding this blue hole in Mastic Point, having spoken to a lot of folks in the village and in various villages looking for my grandmother, Ama Lorena, my fourth grandmother, Lorena, and not really finding the biographical information. People didn't remember her because she died before the oldest in these villages were born. And I was feeling this great sense of loss. Saidi Hartman has a book that begins called Lose Your Mother. So I was feeling that kind of loss of my mother's line. But as I was preparing to leave Mastic Point, what this friend, Tyrone, did is he took me to the blue hole, and I felt her presence there at that hole, which was simultaneously, an emptiness, a void, but it was also a presence. It was a mystery. And I think that is a powerful experience. And I weave that throughout the book of how people of the African diaspora we have holes in our history, in our personal history, but these holes are not just absence, they're also this mysterious presence. And we can talk more about that. It's, and a lot of the mobilization and the strength that we have and that our people have, I think, comes from these kinds of quote unquote holes. The second metaphor is ghost lining, which I connect to the holes in our history, but in these holes live various kinds of ghosts. And there's a different kind of ghost that I'm talking about when I talk about ghost lining. So we have red lining.
Yes.
We have the color line. We're used to thinking about what race does as drawing lines, right? What race does is it divides. It creates a division, segregation, apartheid. It's all about drawing a line. And what I observed at the beginning of this book again is that there's another kind of line that race draws, and that is the ghost line, which is the division between the histories that continually get recognized and are made visible, and the histories and the experiences that are continually actively, made absent and are made invisible. And Black people in countries like the United States and other countries in the world in which there's this long history of racial slavery and its ongoing life, we experience the ghost line continuously in the way the media works, in the way curricula works, in the way political battles work. There's an active work to make invisible our historical experience. And we can talk about how that connects to other experiences, including our spiritual experience, and how other kinds of histories and experiences are made overly visible or overrepresented. That's race at work. And it's just a dimension of how racial politics works that I think it's really useful and helpful to bring into view, right? It's a battle over our minds and our consciousness. That's what the ghost line is trying to draw, is trying to divide.
Absolutely. I mean, it's one of the things I found very compelling about your work is that it is deeply spiritual. I mean, it has the rigor and the precision of the social sciences. You sprinkle the humanities as you were talking. Of course, you use James Baldwin and you kind of close out with Baldwin a little bit in a poem and tribute of Paul Robeson in Colonialism and Global Perspective. It's interesting because I remember, was it Baldwin that said that, love helps you recognize what you don't remember. And you talk about the solutions to this world we live in, this in Black Ghosts and Empire to end, when you talk about recreating sovereignties and social reciprocities with love at the center. And when you were describing the void, obviously in the Western sense, that might be received differently, but you complicate it in a way to say, no, I feel them here. And that search, particularly in Black Ghosts of Empire, and I know we'll get into it as you're talking about these folk, whether it be Ed Blyden or those Spelman missionaries or the great Martin Robeson Delaney. Very few people talk about Blake, so I want you to talk, at least not enough people, I'll put it that way. All of this searching. But when we come back, man, I hope you can help us, perhaps with the first book, talk about these forces that we have been born into and how you help us think about them systemically, but also in terms of our resistance to them. And maybe before it's over, this conversation, you'll tell us a little bit about this this center that you, well, the department that you helped found, Race, Colonialism, and Diaspora. Because if we're gonna get out of this mess, I suppose we're gonna need some rigorous thinking and some application of the thinking. So Chris, we're gonna take a break, and when we come back on the other side, maybe we can start with a little bit of colonialism and global perspective. You can help us think through about how these systems formed and how we have resisted. So we'll be back here at the Black Table with our friend Chris Manjapra, here back in a moment.
President Biden has delivered for Black America. More funding for Black entrepreneurs. Millions of new, good-paying jobs. He's lowering the cost of medications and the cost of living. Joe Biden is delivering for us, and that's the facts.
Welcome back to the Black Table here on the Black Star Network. I'm your regular host, Greg Carr, joined today by Chris Manjapra, author of Colonialism and Global Perspective and Black Ghosts of Empire. Chris, one of the things about this book, Colonialism and Global Perspective, I found fascinating in the context of what we were discussing in the first block. You divide it into two parts, interlocking colonial histories and elementary aspects of colonial power. Rather than just go through straight chronology, you're challenging us to reorganize the way we even think about these things. Do you mind walking us through the framework of the book and what you hope we will learn from it?
Yes, of course. And it's a good exercise for me because I wrote the book some time ago, so it's going to remind myself and refresh myself.
Well, I'll tell you this, as we know, those of us who comic book fans, Killmonger is a central figure in Black Panther, but when Michael B. Jordan played him in the first movie, I don't know that they were going to make him a recurring character, but when he smashed and grabbed that stuff back out of the museum, the Black people were like, yeah, and so they had to bring him back. You opened this book in the museum, man. I said, I like this guy.
That's right.
Go ahead, please.
That's right. Yeah. The brief thing about the intro to the book, and I'm interested in doing more work on this subject as well, is, we don't think about, maybe we do think about, but it's really worth stopping and reflecting on the fact that the history of colonialism has led to a great necropolis, a great hoard of objects, and even of bodies, because colonial powers were collecting the bodies of the enslaved and the colonized and bringing them back to European museums and holding them in these museums. And so when we look at natural history museums across Europe and across the United States, for example, the New York Natural History Museum has a lot of these kinds of objects, which shouldn't be called objects, but rather sacred entities, because many of them are ancestors. United States libraries and universities, hold these kinds of entities as well. What the beginning of the book kind of reflects on, and I use the example of the Belgian Royal Museum, has a lot of materials that it collected from the Congo, and it has a lot of remains of ancestors there. And to think about, to pause, to just stop with that fact, how is it that that's possible? Why isn't there, even more of an outcry that these sacred objects and entities should be freed and returned to their communities? It's happening, and it's happening more than even when the book was being written. But that's where the book begins. Why is it that it's possible for European museums and American museums to even hold ancestral, entities at all, right? Why is that okay? So that's kind of the provocation at the beginning of the book. And I suppose the answer is the fact that we still live in a world in which the systems of colonialism operate. Yeah. Should I talk about what those four systems are? That
if you don't mind, because I mean, the fact that you start with war, it reminds me of Isaiah. I guess was it? No, I started to say Isaiah Berlin, but I'm talking about the other Berlin. I see his face. That does all the work on enslavement, the ancestor. Now, when he said that this war was undeclared, it was asymmetrical, and there was never a truce. So when you talk about this question of war, settlement, plantation, and port, and then and when you talk in part two about these elementary aspects of power, science, school, and debt. Now you can imagine college students have no problem understanding debt. But I mean, please describe to us these systems as you conceive them, and why it's important for us to maybe step back from the number and date kind of history that we typically use to think about the concepts at work in this kind of what Ivan Van Sertima used to call the 500-year room we found ourselves in.
Yeah, sure. Indeed, these four systems that I talk about at the beginning of Black Ghost of Empire, it's useful to understand that colonialism isn't one thing. It is multiple kind of processes and cunning logics, and we can think about it break it down in terms of processes and projects of war, of conquest. Here, the coming of those initial military mercenaries to Hispaniola, to the Americas, starting in the 1400s. They came to do things that previously were not done. And that's the second big system that I talk about, which is settlement. They came to not only settle, but to eradicate the indigenous cultures very systematically, and to establish a new form of state structure, the settler colony. So the second chapter is about settler colonialism, and that relates a lot to indigenous communities and indigenous resistance. And indigenous resistance was there from the start, as it continues today. And then the third is the system of racial slavery, of which the plantation and the mine are at the core. Plantations and mines are obviously places of extraction, of extreme extraction with the hope of extreme accumulation. But they're more than that. What is unique about racial slavery and why it's different from any other slavery, there are many kinds of slavery in history. Why it's different from any other kind is that it was the attempt to own as a property right, not just human beings, but to own the generativity, the life force of human beings, here African human beings. And that specifically meant the ownership right over Black women's wombs. That's what makes racial slavery distinctive. It's partum ventris sequitur, that law, which is that which follows from the womb is also my property, right? That's the unique piece. And we can talk more about that, but it was a very distinctive kind of cunning logic to own the generativity of Black people by trying to own the womb of the Black mother. And then finally, the last one is what I call the port system, which is the use of new infrastructures, of steamships, of war machines, in order to connect different ports and then to move into the hinterlands across the earth. And Asia really became the focus for port colonialism by the time we come to the 1700s. So really the first part of the book is saying, indigenous people, Black people, and Asian people, and also European people, because there are many different groups within Europe who are subordinated. We actually all are being, to use that language, locked together. Our histories are locked together through these interlocking histories of the multiple colonialisms.
Yes.
Therefore, we actually have a common cause to be thinking about in terms of what does decolonization, what does liberation mean if we're actually all linked in a particular way, through these histories.
Yes, and it really is. It really resonated as well for me when you start talking about these resistances, the various forms, the ways that we resist. What did you call it? Actions and non-participation. So I mean, the whole idea that I simply will not be part of this. We just saw, of course, the Vice President of the United States recently in Africa, and standing there at Cape Coast, overcome with emotion at the beginning. But I couldn't help but reflect on what you wrote with regard to Walter Rodney and the participation of Black elites, and how that participation sometimes continues. And even though the vice president's there with a bunch of HBCU presidents, it's very nice. I'm thinking about the underclass in Ghana who is pushing back against President Ado and now them, and then she's in Tanzania, and then in Zambia, where her grandfather was stationed with Kenneth Kaunda. And then, but as you're writing about this question of domination, these questions of settler colonialism, you're also writing about resistance. Yes. So this isn't one of those kind of things like we just people just took it, and it's really before we get to even instances of resistance and Black Ghost of Empire, you talk about these logics, these technologies of domination with regard to science, school, and debt. Do you mind saying a word about that, and then we'll take a break and come back? How do those three concepts operate in this field of perpetual violence and resistance that we find?
So the brief answer to your question, if there's time in this segment, would be, science created ways of talking about the world that categorized and assigned people into places according to things like skin color, or things like, what part of the world they were born in. It created a hierarchy of which white supremacy, was organizing, through which white supremacists were organizing the world. So there was a way that knowledge, that science is playing a role in racialization, and that helped the colonial project. Certainly debt is another example of, in other words, I think the key point here is that weapons that colonialism uses are not always going to be the gun and the spear, right? They're going to be other kinds of weapons. And one of the key weapons is debt, to make certain groups of people, racialized groups, to make them holders of burdens of debt, thereby makes them indebted. And if they're indebted, then they are subjected and subordinated, and they become more open to criminalization. So debt is an invention that actually serves the colonial project. And we could think about schools and curricula as another kind of invention that has served colonial. Think about the way we teach history, right? So colonialism is cunning, and it has a lot of different tricks up its sleeve. But guess what? I mean, the colonized people have a lot of tricks up their sleeve too. I think that's really important to emphasize. This is not a one-sided story.
Absolutely. Listen, man, let me apologize, Chris, in advance, because those of you, and I encourage everyone to get both books, but particularly the one we've been talking about so far, mostly Colonialism and Global Perspective, Cambridge University Press. There are a lot of our viewers who have gone out and purchased these texts, and please forgive me for you doing a ruthless synthesizing of the main points in an academic text in about.
Believe me, as a historian, I love it, because it means people in a little classroom might hear about the material, right? So I'm happy. I'm happy.
Good, very good, because that is our objective, brother. We want everybody, we want Cambridge to be like, where are these orders coming from? So
everybody out there who's listening knows what you can do. Just go ahead, get on the website, order the book. Yeah.
Absolutely. So when we come back, we're going to get more heavily into Black Ghost of Empire, so we can talk about these resistances that you literally weave throughout this text. So we'll be back with Brother Chris Manjapra, author of both these texts, in a moment here at the Black Table.
On his first day in office, with the country in crisis, President Biden got to work for us. Cutting Black child poverty in half, more money for Black entrepreneurs, millions of new, good-paying jobs. He's lowered the cost of living and prescription drugs. But there's more to do. He gets it because we all deserve dignity, safety, respect, and a chance to do more than just get by, but to get ahead.
I'm Joe Biden, and I approve this message.
Folks, Black Star Network is here.
Oh, no punches!
I'm real revolutionary right now.
Support this man, Black Media. He makes sure that our stories are told.
Thank you for being the voice of Black America, Roland.
Stay Black. I love y'all.
All momentum we have now, we have to keep this going.
The video looks phenomenal.
See, there's a difference between Black Star Network and Black-owned media and something like CNN.
You can't be Black-owned media and be scared.
It's time to be smart.
Bring your eyeballs home.
You dig?
Welcome back to Black Table here on the Black Star Network. I'm your regular host, Greg Carr. Remember to support the Black Star Network. Download the app, join the Bring the Funk fan club, and certainly keep us going because this is the kind of work that we all are committed to. This is liberation work. We're back with our friend and brother, Chris Manjapra, author of Black Ghost of Empire and Colonialism and Global Perspective. Chris, in Black Ghost of Empire, and, obviously, you're a well-heeled academic, published a number of things. And then this book kind of a more broad audience, perhaps you might think. But when I saw Sir Hilary Beckles shouted out, I said, okay, I know our brother from the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America and NARC and all of the global reparations work that you talk about in this book. The idea that wrongs should give to remedies, that reparations is more than just about a check or economics. You really ground that conversation with Black Ghosts of Empire. I mentioned at the beginning how my students in the hip hop class I teach at Howard, they seized that ghost line metaphor to really explore how they knew virtually nothing of hip hop of the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. And so we were playing like recent protest hip hop. They could see the thrust there, but then when we went back to even the Rodney King rebellions of 1992, they were like, Rodney King, I think I've heard. And they were like, I like this ghost line metaphor that Prof. Manjapra brought up because you can see the erasures, the serial erasures. How important is this disconnection to this process of trying to subjugate us? And what are some of the ways we found our ways around it that you kind of explore in Black Ghost of Empire?
Yeah, well, it's crucial. We were just talking in the last segment about these different strategies of colonialism. This is another one of them, right? The ghostlining is a strategy of colonialism, is erasure and trying to erase our even proximate and distant, history, and especially the history of freedom fighters and folks who have long been working for liberation. So one of the key goals that I had in writing Black Ghost of Empire, which is the story about a chain of emancipations. We think of emancipation as like once in time, but there were many, many emancipations. There were, actually more than 100 different emancipations that took place from the 1770s all the way to the 1920s. They learned from each other. They were, as I argue in the book and show in the book, they were not innocent projects, and they were not at all about ending racial oppression. They were about redirecting it, and this argument really upsets, you can imagine, certain kinds of historians, and then certain kinds of politics, but I continue to have to make the argument because this is accurate, that emancipations are not what we think they were. On the other hand, it is also the case that Black communities from the beginning always had an idea of what we called self-emancipation, what we also called liberation. And the book is also about what these different kinds and projects of liberation look like. I can talk about that in a second, but I want to mention one thing that's important is that even the reparations discussions today that are going on and that are gaining strength, they have their charge because of more than 200 years of a reparations history, a reparations movement history. And those movements for the reparation of slavery have always been organized against the injustices of emancipations. They don't emerge because emancipation was successful and now we need to figure out how to, address the problems of slavery. The real problem is that the problems that slavery invented have continued over time. And what reparations are really about is saying, how do we really transform society, right? And stop racial violence, which is so endemic. So it's a different way of thinking about even how we locate our reparations discussions today and how deeply historical these are. These are built on 200 years at least of activism by our ancestors.
Absolutely. And particularly when you delve in chapter 5 from Civil War to Dirty War Against Black Lives, you call the roll, man. I mean, the ancestors, whether it be Callie House and Queen Mother Moore. I mean, I had the pleasure of knowing Queen Mother Moore a little bit. So, from my early days when I was a youngster, man, when you evoke those ancestors, not enough people are raising them and building that connection. And I'm quite sure that there are many in the academy who are upset when you say that emancipation, what do you say? It's not the end, it's a new beginning.
They don't like that, brother. They have made that clear.
I'm sure, but that's all right though. You with the people today, brother. We understand. It reminded me of something Carter Woodson wrote. Yeah. Carter Woodson wrote in The Miseducation of the Negro. He says, Jim Crow is the sequel to slavery. I mean, he kind of teases that, and so help us with. I love how you talk about these 4 elements like solidarity, land, law, and structure. How it looked like it was emancipation or in the form of freedom and movement, but it really wasn't. They figured a way for this thing to reform this, what did you call it in colonialism? This force field, this kind of fabric to fold itself over and reform. How are these sequential moments, whether it be the British saying, okay, we've abolished, but then you take them to Sierra Leone and take them to Nova Scotia, the whole question of law and structure. How do these things operate to make emancipation not the end of the misery, but an extension of it?
Yeah, excellent. Great question. I'm going to say it really in a really short form, and then I want to give the detail after that. So the short form is when law and policy conspire to solve a problem by excluding the community that has been affected by the problem, that is the beginning of the end of an actual solution. In other words, if you are going to really want to address how do we, repair the harm that slavery has done, then you cannot do that without by excluding the actual enslaved or the freed people who were affected by slavery. It's just not going to work. And so that's what all of the policies and policy decisions and all of the laws of emancipation did. They actively not only excluded the enslaved or the freed peoples from the conversation around what an end should look like, but even more than that, they resubjected them, right? They put them into new forms of bondage. So that was the cunning. And the details are, and I go through a number of examples. We look at the 1770s, they had, in the 1770s in Philadelphia, where emancipation began, which was gradual emancipation, there was the plan to put enslaved people into a new condition called apprenticeship, which would be another form of unpaid bondage. And they would live in that condition for, up to 15 years or more, and then they would be freed. So it wasn't about bringing to the table. It was about how do we continue this bondage with a different name. Other forms of emancipation like what happened in the British Empire in the 1830s, involved just the bald-faced payment of huge amounts of money to the enslavers. Again, recognizing that, the enslavers' right, the property right that they claim to have in Black people's bodies, and like I was saying earlier, in specifically the bodies of Black women, that right was legitimate and it needed to be compensated by the state. And that state compensation created a debt legacy that British taxpayers and also people of the colonies and the post-colonies had been paying to Britain, although had been paying off, I should say, until 2015. So for 180 years, the British state was still paying for that compensation it paid to the British slave owners.
Hold on, let me, just for a second, Chris, because when Queen Elizabeth passed, this came up, and a lot of people were shocked. You mean tell me they were still paying for our bodies as recently as our living memory?
As recently as a few years ago, yes, because it was being every year legitimated and reaffirmed that this is a legitimate kind of transfer, of payment, of debt, that a country should have. So absolutely, yeah, including Black Britons. Black
people pay taxes, right? So we were literally paying them for our heads.
That's right. I mean, Black Britons, some people for their whole lives had been paying through their taxes for this compensation that had been paid not to the enslaved, but to the slave owners. I think that's maybe the underlying assertion and claim, which I think really upsets a certain kind of, a certain group, a large group of mainstream commentators, is this assertion that reparations have already long been paid. I mean, we're not in a world in which people don't pay reparations. It's just that the reparations have been over and over and over again paid to the slave owners and to their children and their progeny, and thereby over and over again there's been a reenactment of the extraction and the degradation and the disrespect that has been paid, to the enslaved and then to their descendants and their progeny. It's like a cascading system. Yeah. And let's not forget the role under Jim Crow that extra legal forms of violence played in this. For example, all of the lynching campaigns, the white capping campaigns, the informal ways that Black people in the South, in the North know of forms of Jim Crow exclusion, but also the criminal legal system, right? And the role that criminal legal systems played and play today in paying a certain kind of advantage forward to white communities, and thereby also disinvesting and harming Black communities through the way that racial law works. So these systems continue, but not always. These reparations, I should say, continue, but these reverse reparations, but not in the ways that are going to be very obvious necessarily on first view.
Yes. I'll tell you what, why don't we pause here and so we'll have a little more time when we come back, because the fact that, and you're right, that anti-Blackness and certainly this form of whiteness that enacts these kind of violences has never been recognized as a crime against humanity. I was at the United Nations a few weeks ago, and just seeing the energy of it actually was the week when they were talking about various issues of particular concern to women, and to see all these women, particularly women of African descent from all over the world convening, given what you've just said and written. And of course, think about Michael Gomez, who talks about that the assault on Black women in many ways is at the center of the formation of Blackness in the modern world. There was our resistance to it. You feel a sense of hope. And I think you write about this hopeful suspension of final judgments. But then you realize that this framework, we're going to have to overflow the framework, because even though the conversation is good, nothing is going to change until the people organize. So maybe we'll take our break. When we come back, you can walk us through some of the things you write about in terms of these forms of resistance that we have found ourselves creating to overflow the boundaries of these systems. So we'll do that when we come back in a moment, in our final segment here at the Black Table with Professor Chris Manjapra of Tufts University, author of the book we're talking about right now, Black Ghosts of Empire, The Long Death of Slavery and the failure of emancipation. Back in a moment here at the Black Table.
On his first day in office, with the country in crisis, President Biden got to work for us. Cutting Black child poverty in half, more money for Black entrepreneurs, millions of new, good-paying jobs. He's lowered the cost of living and prescription drugs. But there's more to do. He gets it because we all deserve dignity, safety, respect, and a chance to do more than just get by, but to get ahead.
I'm Joe Biden, and I approve this message.
Don't you think it's time to get wealthy? I'm Deborah Owens, America's Wealth Coach, and my new show on the Black Star Network focuses on the things your financial advisor or bank isn't telling you. So watch Get Wealthy on the Black Star Network.
Welcome back to the Black Table here on the Black Star Network. Remember to support the Black Star Network. Download the app, join the Bring the Funk fan club, tell your friends all over the world. This is the conversation that we're having and the work we're doing here on the network. We're back with Professor Chris Manjapra. Chris, in Black Ghosts of Empire, you talk about this question of reparative justice as one of the oldest liberation struggles. You don't anchor it just in trying to play by the rules of this constantly shifting system. And one of the things that really struck me, because, you know, Black Star Network's anchored here in Washington, D.C., which celebrates every April Emancipation Day, tying to the conversation you were having in Block 3 about how these folk were compensated. Of course, they were compensated here in Washington, D.C., but you talk about this beautiful, watchful witness and how these Africans created these rituals of resistance, man. I myself went to Watch Night in Nashville, Tennessee. Did not know until an adult that was partially because these Africans in places where we were not yet emancipated were praying in that day. Could you talk about, throughout the book, these forms of resistance that Black people create? And that those passages on Emancipation Days, brother, I'll tell you, warm my heart. But please walk us through some of these resistance forms.
Yeah, thank you. I loved your language, brother, of overflowing the system and you know, transforming, radically transforming the system. It's nothing less than that has long been the goal, but also, frankly, also the practice of so many of our communities. That's our history. It's not a history. It is a history of waiting, and it's also a history of radical liberation in practice. And so I would say there are kind of four main kinds of response, of transformative response, that have been brought over hundreds of years. One of them I'd like to call, you know, Reconstructionism. And we know that there was, you know, a period of Reconstruction in U.S. history, but throughout time, going all the way back to the time when when abolitions first started, Black communities were involved in many forms of Reconstructionism. I'll give you one concrete example, which is that in places like Guyana, in places like Antigua and in Jamaica, when slavery was in the process of ending, Black communities fled, as they had long fled, you know, through being marooning out of the plantations, but they fled to new collective lands, where they then created new settlements. And these were called the freedom villages, the free villages, in which they were restructuring, you know, politics and society in a way that meant liberation to them. So they weren't just waiting, they were creating through these freedom villages. Another example would be Pan-Africanism. It's another liberation invention that when Black communities thought about their liberation and started enacting it, they always did it in a Pan-Africanist way. You know, I love the invitation that Brother Gregory gave me to talk about Blake. One concrete example in this novel by Martin Delaney, which I love, is how, Delaney has this plot of Black folk across Cuba and the American South and the American North and the west coast of Africa, all who had been affected by slavery at the time in which slavery is still in existence. There is this large-scale revolt that begins. And all of these Black communities, they all reconverge to this new place called Africa, which is located, he in his imagination locates in Cuba. And he says they're creating a new world. This is Wakanda in a certain sense, and it's a real thing. Was a real and is a real project of the Pan-African power that we have in our diaspora. And I'll give you one more example, which is very salient. Here, I want to invoke another one of our great ancestors, Fannie Lou Hamer, and the Freedom Farms, and that movement to create on collective land, create collective benefit, through the pig farms, through the pig banks, and through the food banks, and through these collective modes of sharing the bounty of the earth. Fannie Lou Hamer was onto that. She was onto the ecological dimension of how do we address, the food deserts and the health deserts that our people still experience today. And again, the answer was grassroots mobilization. So I think that's really what I find so inspiring. The state is, it has its limits, and our people have long been involved. Think again, Reconstruction and how important the pouring in of Black politicians into the government were. It continues today in important ways. So that's the top-down part of it, right? How do we change the state and make its policies more just? But the bottom-up part of it is really where the inspiration is, which is our communities have not waited. We've just gone out and created these, transformed liberation spaces. And that's reparations too. That's part of the reparations discussion. That's part of our history.
Absolutely. It's beautiful. Think about it. It's so funny. And by the way, we policy to raise Jacqueline Cookie Hamer Flakes, Fannie Lou Hamer and Pap Hamer's daughter, who recently made transition in March. It's so beautiful when you bring that up. And I love how you frame Martin Delaney as one of the parents of Afrofuturism. I mean, he's actually included in the exhibit now that's at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and talking to Ronaldo Anderson, one of the authors of the companion volume. And so it always like, okay, we read Frederick Douglass, sure, we read Harriet Jacobs, but Blake, it seems to me like Blake is the one that the children would love. This guy, Blake, is no joke, man. So
it's like you go watch Black Panther and then you got to read Blake, right? Because he's there.
No, so I'm sure
he's on that wave. Yeah,
taking notes. Go get Blake or the Huts of America, y'all. But you bring the book to a close, evoking something that now everybody knows about in the United States and around the world, increasingly, Juneteenth. You marry Ralph Ellison, which I'm sure if Ellison was here, he might be spinning it. Wait, you just married me to these Black nationalists? Anyway, but I thought about it, man. Last summer, of course, Juneteenth, now a federal holiday in the United States. The Juneteenth flag is red and blue with this white little star in the middle. But these American Negroes made it red, black, and green. You understand? Now, this is not supposed to have anything to do. Could you talk about how Juneteenth and those emancipation days and this network of this kind of placemaking among African people is kind of representative of this liberatory spirit? And of course, you got Black Lives Matter in here, and in the previous volume, you see the connections, you evoked all that work. How are these things helping us not to wait on anything, but basically repair ourselves, personhood, as you talk about?
Yes. I mean, what a great way to think about what our Juneteenth celebration, what any of our other emancipation celebrations. So here I'm thinking about also the August 1st Caribbean emancipation celebration, which are important to our people. What the spirit of the celebration is, it's not it's not really a celebration of the successful end of racial oppression and slavery. So it's not that kind of a celebration. But what it is what my dear sister and one of our great living thinkers, Black thinkers, Erna Broadbur, who lives in Jamaica, what she says, it's an opportunity for our people to come together and talk about our business. I love, it's simple and clear language. That's what Juneteenth is about. Any emancipation celebration is about our people who know in our bones and our fibers the ongoing history, the ongoing effects and the unending experience of an unjust social system, for us to come together and to talk about what freedom is, what liberation really means, and what our plans are to make it more real tomorrow, right? Or to sustain also the place that we've gotten to, especially in terms of our consciousness and preserving preserving the freedom of our consciousness. That's what it's really about. What Erna Broadbur does, and this would be on July 31st, because it's in Jamaica, it's for their emancipation. What she does is every year she holds an emancipation play. And she has, it's in a village in Jamaica, and members of the village and some visitors, they all have a different role in the play. And the play is an amazing, thing, because what it is the villagers speaking to the Queen, right? So here's the Queen of England, the reenactment, and the villagers are not saying, oh, Queen of England, thank you so much for giving us our freedom. The villagers are saying, well, what is this freedom that you're trying to give us? Why is it that the terms for this are that your planters are getting paid and we're not getting anything? That reenactment is a way of reopening the question, right, of what is justice and has it been met? And if not, well, what's needed to meet it? It's a refresher. It's a refresher for our spirit. That's what Juneteenth is for. Yeah.
That's beautiful, and it's so important, as you said, those rights of August 1st, as our colleague, what's Jeff's last name? He wrote the book. He's at Howard University. Jeffrey Kerr Ritchie, right, about that, among others. So these rights are all connected, and it's always so wonderful when people who weren't aware of other rituals become aware of them and realize we were doing this. Oh, this is beautiful. I mean, the difference and the similarity. As we come to a pause for now, because we definitely want you to come back, brother, and have more conversations with us. What are you working on now, man? And tell us, some of the ways, and some of the ways folk can find you and be in contact and share and help in the work.
Yes, absolutely. So find me on my website, www.historiesofresistance.com. I think we're going to share that.
Yes.
Also. I'm also on Twitter at HistResist. I'd love to have your likes or, add me on Twitter. And what I'm working on now, I'm very excited to be working on, remember I mentioned Fannie Lou Hamer. So I'm working on ecological resistance, reparative ecologies, the different grassroots ways that Black communities have sought to recreate, to replenish the earth, to draw power from the earth, how that connects to maroon communities. So this is really, to me, exciting that, if we think about this long-standing way in which Black and Indigenous communities have responded to racial oppression by, number one, fugitivity, right, running away from the plantation, and then number two, reconnecting with the earth. And how many of our rituals and our rites are about reconnecting those relationships with the earth and with other species. That's what I'm interested in learning more about, and there's a lot to learn, especially when once now I'm looking to try to meet some of the amazing plant healers that we have in our communities, people who know what it is to listen to the plants, and the plants tell us what we need for our bodies. It's a whole other way of thinking, and we have those potentials for repair in our traditions too. So yeah, ecological reparations. What does that all look like? That's where I'm headed.
Man, you have conjured a lot of ancestors. I'm hearing George Washington Carver. He said, the plants tell me what to do. I'm not, this isn't the science degree I got. Yes. So, and of course, our friend Rakia Lumumba and Malcolm X Grassroots Coalition, what they're doing in Jackson, Mississippi. So much, man, in this work. So we cannot wait to share in what you're producing now. And we're glad that you came and joined us for this hour, Chris, and we want you to come back soon. This is our brother Chris Manjapra, who is the founding chair of the Department of Studies in Race, Colonialism, and Diaspora at Tufts University, also professor of history, author of the two books we've discussed today, and most importantly, a thinker who is deeply connected with our ancestors, with what we're doing now, and projecting into the future of true human liberation. So thank you for joining us today, brother.
This was great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Of course, we'll be back in a moment to clear the table. We'll have some final words. We'll draw from Professor Manjapra, in fact, from Black Ghost of Empire to close the show, and we'll get ready for next week. Back in a moment here at the Black Table.
President Biden has delivered for Black America. More funding for Black entrepreneurs. Millions of new good-paying jobs. He's lowering the cost of medications and the cost of living. Joe Biden is delivering for us, and that's the facts.
Hatred on the streets, a horrific scene, a white nationalist rally that descended into deadly violence.
White people are losing their damn minds. As an angry pro-Trump mob storms the U.S. Capitol, we're about to see the rise of what I call white minority resistance.
We have seen white folks in this country who simply cannot tolerate black folks voting.
I think what we're seeing is the inevitable result of violent denial.
This is part of American history. Every time that people of color have made progress, whether real or symbolic, there has been what Carol Anderson at Emory University calls white rage as a backlash.
This is the rise of the Proud Boys and the Boogaloo Boys. America, there's going to be more of this.
Here's all the Proud Boys, guys.
This country is getting increasingly racist in its behaviors and its attitudes because of the fear of white people.
The fear that they're taking our jobs, they're taking our resources, they're taking our women. This is white fear.
Back to the Black Table here on the Black Star Network. Remember to support the Black Star Network. This is independent journalism, Black owned and created. Roland Martin, the curator of the Black Star Network, himself from Houston, the son of Juneteenth. As an African person born there in the South, he reminds us all the time, self-determination is the best way to go. We've spent a very important hour with Professor Chris Manjapra. We're very glad to have him. And in fact, let's close and clear the table with words from Black Ghost of Empire. Professor Manjapra writes, history's unendings demand that we linger with the voids and not look past them. And history requires that individuals, institutions, states, and international organizations participate in reckoning with reparations for slavery. Emancipation processes saw the future after slavery through the eyes of perpetrators. Justice requires the proper readjustment of the relationship between all of us, affected by the legacies of slavery, to something more human, something more than human, so that we may make something shared and new together from all the plundered parts. We'll let that linger. Y'all get these books. Table is clear. We're going to see you next week. Thanks for joining us.